Have you ever noticed how often, in moments of fear and uncertainty, people look for someone else to fix things? Someone powerful, decisive, even ruthless. Darkness has a way of making us desperate for authority, even when that authority ends up doing more harm than good. Welcome to Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be taking a look at 3 readings from the Christian Bible through the lens of sacred myth. As we reflect on the readings for the 3rd Sunday in Ordinary Time, we'll explore what these stories say about living in dark times, resisting oppression, and rediscovering the power of ordinary people acting together rather than fragmenting into tribes. In this episode, we're asking a tough question. When the world feels like it's unraveling, do we wait for someone else to save us? Or do we have the courage to step forward, let go of our familiar comforts, and work together to create something better? So grab a comfy seat, a glass of your favorite beverage, and let's look at some ancient stories together in this edition of Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be exploring the readings for the 3rd Sunday in Ordinary Time, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. In this series, we're exploring readings from the Bible through the lens of sacred myth, looking for interpretations and lessons that don't require belief in the supernatural. These texts were written by pre-scientific people, shaped by their own cultures, needs, and agendas. Not as historic books or scientific manuals, but as meaning-making stories for their communities. And just like believers approach these writings through the lens of faith, I approach them through a more humanistic lens, one grounded in the idea that certain foundational values helped humans evolve and flourish. Now, you might agree with the lessons I find, or you might find something completely different. That's the beauty of treating these writings as sacred myth. We're free to negotiate with the text and discover whatever insights we need right now. So with that, let's dive in. As I said, tonight we'll be looking at the readings for the 3rd Sunday in Ordinary Time, Cycle A. Our first reading is from the prophet Isaiah. It's chapter 8, verses 23 through chapter 9, verse 3. Our second reading is from the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 1, verses 10 through 13, and verse 17. And our gospel reading is from Matthew. It's chapter 4, verses 12 through 23. Now, we'll start by going through all 3 of the readings, then we'll look for the messages and the main lesson in each one. Finally, we'll bring everything together, look at what it means for us today, and talk about where we go from here. And with that, let's begin. Our first reading is from Isaiah. Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who were in distress. In the past he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future he will honor Galilee of the nations, by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Our second reading is from 1 Corinthians. I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree with one another in what you say, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly united in mind and thought. My brothers and sisters, some from Chloe's household, have informed me that there are quarrels among you. What I mean is this. One of you says, I follow Paul. Another, I follow Apollos. Another, I follow Cephas. Still another, I follow Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom and eloquence, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. And our gospel reading is from Matthew. When Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, he withdrew to Galilee. Leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum, which was by the lake in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali, to fulfill what was said through the prophet Isaiah, land of Zebulun and Naphtali, the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people living in darkness have seen a great light. Those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. From that time on, Jesus began to preach, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near." As Jesus was waiting beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, called Peter, and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness among the people. All right, so let's go back and take a critical look at these readings and see what learnings and lessons we can find if we dig around just a little bit. So our first reading was from Isaiah. And when we step away from the usual supernatural lens, well, this passage, it speaks to something that's deeply human, at the experience of living through dark times, but refusing to be defined by those dark times. Darkness here doesn't need to mean cosmic evil or divine punishment. It looks a lot like political instability or economic hardship, fear and social fragmentation. So the appearance of light isn't magic. It's what happens when people rediscover clarity, courage, and the will to keep going. So hope in this sense isn't passive optimism. Hope is the decision to keep thinking, to keep questioning, and keep imagining a way forward, even when the circumstances are kind of grim. But maybe the most important idea in this passage is the breaking of the yoke and the rod of the oppressor. That language points directly to human agency. Liberation doesn't arrive because someone waits long enough or believes hard enough. Liberation happens because people decide that injustice is no longer acceptable. Tyranny, whether political, economic, or cultural, tyranny persists when it's treated as inevitable. This text pushes back on that resignation and insists that oppressive systems can be challenged and dismantled. And that can be done through collective effort and moral resolve. Of course, just as important is the communal nature of the joy that's described. The rejoicing here isn't private or individual, it's shared. That's because human flourishing isn't just about personal relief. It never has been. Human flourishing is about communities healing together, celebrating together, and rediscovering solidarity after long periods of strain and tension. The image of light also points toward knowledge and understanding, a reasoned insight that cuts through the fear, cuts through the superstition and the manipulation. When people learn, organize, and act together, darkness loses its grip. So the main lesson I got from our first reading is that we end darkness by choosing hope, resisting oppression, and acting together. Taken as a whole, this passage offers a grounded vision of hope that's rooted in human responsibility. Darkness ends not because it mysteriously disappears, but because people choose to confront it. By resisting oppression, by pursuing understanding, and by standing together. That kind of hope is demanding, but it's also realistic. We end darkness by choosing hope, resisting oppression, and acting together. Our second reading was from the first letter to the Corinthians, and this passage puts its finger on a familiar human problem, the tendency to fracture into camps organized around people rather than principles. The Corinthians weren't arguing about values so much as they were arguing about allegiance, who they followed, who they trusted, who they thought mattered most. Now, read humanistically, this isn't an ancient church problem. This is a timeless social pattern. When movements shift their focus from a shared mission to competing personalities, energy that should be spent on progress gets consumed by rivalry, suspicion, and status seeking. Paul's call for unity doesn't require everyone to think the same way. Instead, it points toward cooperation around a common goal. Healthy communities allow disagreement. They debate, and they have a wide diversity of thought, but they don't let those differences harden into tribes that undermine the collective action. From a secular perspective, this is about prioritizing outcomes over egos. When people stay anchored to a shared purpose, differences can sharpen ideas rather than fracture the relationships. This can also be a quiet but important critique of style over substance. Paul downplays his own role and rejects the idea that clever rhetoric or some personal magnetism should be the center of attention. Right? That approach models ethical leadership. That's grounded in integrity and humility. That's what Paul was demonstrating. Ideas matter because of their impact on human well-being, not because of who delivers those messages. When leaders try to attract followers instead of trying to empower others, movements weaken. And when communities reward substance over spectacle, they become much more resilient. Anyway, the main lesson I got from our second reading is that progress depends on shared purpose, not loyalty to personalities. This reading offers a practical lesson in collective responsibility. Progress stalls when loyalty to personalities replaces commitment to shared goals. Progress accelerates when people resist these tribal instincts in favor of cooperation, humility, and mutual accountability. Strong communities don't orbit around individual leaders. Those are brittle communities. Strong communities orient themselves around a mission that everyone owns. Progress depends on shared purpose, not loyalty to personalities. Okay, our final reading was from the Gospel of Matthew. And we should see this passage as opening with a moment of courage rather than some sort of divine orchestration. When John is arrested, the story doesn't move toward retreat or caution. It moves toward responsibility. Jesus steps into a leadership vacuum and begins working in a place that's often overlooked and politically tense. It's stripped of all the religious framing. This is a familiar human pattern. Progress doesn't wait for perfect conditions. Progress happens when someone decides that silence, fear, or delay will only deepen the darkness. And then that person chooses to act. Now, just as striking is who gets invited into the work. There's no search for experts. Jesus isn't out there looking for the elites or the insiders. The call goes out to ordinary people who are in the middle of their everyday chores and labor. From a secular perspective, this affirms a simple but powerful truth. Meaningful change is rarely driven by credentials alone. It's driven by people who are willing to show up, willing to learn, and willing to commit. Social movements, ethical reform, community healing, they all depend on recognizing the potential of everyday people, not waiting for saviors or even specialists. The decision to leave their nets behind works as a metaphor for reordering priorities. In this story, the fishermen's nets, that represents safety and routine, familiarity, the things that make life kind of predictable. And yet they're also the things that can limit growth. Change requires letting go of certain habits and assumptions that no longer serve the common good. The closing of this reading emphasizes on teaching and healing, and it points toward a holistic vision of human flourishing, an expanding understanding while actively reducing suffering. The reading said Jesus went around teaching in their synagogues and healing everyone along the way. Knowledge without compassion is hollow. Compassion without insight is unsustainable. Progress requires both. So the main lesson I got from our gospel reading is that change begins when ordinary people choose to step beyond comfort and act together. This reading presents change as a human choice rather than a miraculous event. It begins when people step forward instead of standing by, when ordinary individuals commit to a shared purpose, and when communities invest in both understanding and care. That's when progress happens. Transformation doesn't come from comfort or waiting around. Transformation comes from collective action that's grounded in courage and concern for others. Change begins when ordinary people choose to step beyond comfort and act together. All right, let's review the lessons we've talked about so far. In our first reading from Isaiah, the main lesson I came away with was, we end darkness by choosing hope, resisting oppression, and acting together. In our second reading from 1 Corinthians, the main lesson I got was, progress depends on shared purpose, not loyalty to personalities. And finally, the main lesson I got from our gospel reading was, change begins when ordinary people choose to step beyond comfort and act together. These readings speak directly into the fear and instability of the moment we're living in. The post-World War II order has been badly fractured. Not by cooperation gone wrong, but by leaders, especially Trump and his Christian nationalist allies, who reject cooperation altogether and mistake domination for strength. What's striking is how completely that impulse contradicts the very scriptures they claim to defend. These stories don't glorify conquest or unconditional rule. They lift up ordinary people who refuse despair, resist oppression, and choose to act together. Darkness doesn't lift because someone powerful declares victory. Darkness lifts when people organize, rethink their loyalties, and then commit to a shared purpose. That's where hope comes from right now. Not from strongmen or sacred slogans, but from cooperation. We need the individual courage to join in collective action. These ancient stories remind us that when ordinary people stop waiting, stop fragmenting into tribes, and start working together, humanity doesn't just survive, it continues to flourish. So let's step back and take another look at these readings overall and see if we can figure out what these lessons really mean to us in our daily lives. To do this, I'll try to answer two questions. So what? And now what? Okay, so what? Why should we care about any of this? Well, we should care about this because waiting has become a dangerous habit. Too many people are frozen, telling themselves nothing meaningful can happen until the next election, assuming there will be a next election. When Trump openly questions the need for elections and claims the country has never been governed better, that's not bluster. It's authoritarian signaling. Courage is required here, now, not later. And while individual action can feel risky, collective action changes the math. When people step up together, fear loses its grip. These lessons are important because isolation, whether personal or political, isolation hands power to those who crave domination. Strong men thrive when people feel alone, overwhelmed, or convinced their voice doesn't matter. These stories from the Christian Bible push back hard on that lie. They remind us that change has always come from ordinary people organizing, refusing despair, and acting together. Power doesn't only flow downward from leaders. It builds sideways through cooperation. We should care about this because progressives often sabotage themselves and their coalitions with purity tests. And a purity test is when someone decides you only count as an ally if you agree with them on everything, instead of working together around shared goals despite some real differences. Too many coalitions collapse because they mistake shared goal for shared tactics or even shared priorities. If someone isn't fully aligned with a specific project, climate, housing, wages, income inequality, they're treated as an obstacle instead of an ally. That is a losing strategy. Human flourishing is the larger goal, and those individual efforts are parts of that whole. Movements grow strong when they make room for differences without losing sight of the larger shared destination. This is important because darkness doesn't lift through domination. It lifts through cooperation. These ancient stories don't tell us to wait for saviors or cling to our tribes. They tell us to rethink our loyalties and build something together. That's how we push back against fear-driven politics and fractured communities, not by demanding everyone agree on everything, but by committing to a common purpose that's big enough to hold us all. That's how ordinary people dispel the darkness. And that's why this moment demands individual courage and collective action. Not someday, but right now. All right, the last question I try to answer is, now what? What are we supposed to do? Well, when the world feels unstable and loud, one of the easiest things to lose is our sense of connection. And our connection to other people, to a shared purpose, and even to ourselves sometimes. Fear thrives in isolation. So does cynicism. But history shows that real change doesn't begin with mass movements or dramatic gestures. It really begins when ordinary people refuse to stay disconnected. So with that in mind, here's your challenge for the week. Reach out to one person you haven't talked to in a while. Could be a neighbor, a coworker, friend, or a family member. Don't make it about politics or persuasion. Just check in. Ask how they're doing. Listen more than you talk. The goal isn't agreement. The goal is reconnection. Now this matters because connection with others is the foundation of courage. When we feel less alone, we're more willing to step up. We're willing to speak honestly and act with integrity. Rebuilding even one relationship helps counter the isolation that fear-based politics depend on. And it strengthens the social fabric we all rely on. often more than we realize. My wife and I share our life together. We're spouses, but we're also genuinely good friends. And we happen to see eye to eye politically, which means we don't argue about politics. But there is a downside to that. It can start to feel like it's just the two of us against the world. Instead of feeling connected, we sometimes feel like an island. And I suspect a lot of other couples feel that way right now. When you're only reinforcing each other's reactions, and the news is almost nothing but bad, it's easy to unintentionally make things worse. Fear amplifies fear. Outrage feeds outrage. Now, we can reinforce each other's hope, too, but that doesn't easily happen unless we let other people into the conversation. Last September, we moved back to Michigan after years in Virginia, which put us closer to family. That helped. Most of them are like-minded, not right-wing Christian nationalist types, and spending time together has made a real difference. But I've also started reaching out to old friends. Some I know I agree with politically. Others I don't know for sure. And honestly, that's okay. I don't need perfect alignment with everyone in order to feel less alone. What I've learned is that expanding our connections is healthy, psychologically and emotionally. Not every relationship has to fit neatly into the same political box in order to matter. You just need enough shared ground to remind you that you're not doing this alone. Once that starts to happen, it becomes easier to find the courage to act with others instead of retreating inward. I've even joined a local political advocacy group, which is something I'd encourage people to consider. But I also know that it's a lot easier to do stuff like that when you've already rebuilt some personal connections first. All of it helps. It makes us feel less isolated, more grounded, and just a bit more courageous when it comes to standing up to injustice and working toward a better future together. So please accept this week's challenge. Reach out to one person you haven't talked to in a while and reconnect. Over time, these small acts of reconnection make you more grounded, more resilient, and better equipped to engage the world without burning out. These renewed connections can remind you that cooperation isn't some abstract ideal. Cooperation is something you practice, one conversation at a time. Well, before I wrap things up, I'd like to leave you with one more thought. American author and disability rights advocate Helen Keller once wrote, "Alone we can do so little. Together we can do so much." As you probably know, Helen Keller was blind and deaf, but she certainly wasn't dumb. She was a brilliant young girl who simply needed the support and cooperation of other people in order to come out of the darkness and learn to share her thoughts and ideas with the world. Now, this quote hits even harder when you consider the source, but also because it names something we all feel but don't always say out loud. Being isolated shrinks us. Being alone, for whatever reason, makes everything bad seem worse, and it seems to taint the otherwise good things that happen. But connection expands what's possible. None of us is meant to carry fear, responsibility, or even hope all by ourselves. When we try, everything feels heavier and harder than it needs to be. But when we reach out, even in small, ordinary ways, we multiply our capacity to endure and to take positive action. That's why this week's challenge matters so much. Reconnecting with just one person isn't a political strategy, and it's certainly not a grand gesture. It's just a simple act of care. It reminds us that we're part of something larger than our own worries, and that courage grows in relationship, not in isolation. Every time you choose connection, you're quietly strengthening the bonds that make resilience, cooperation, and meaningful change possible. You're doing more than you realize, and you're not doing it alone. All right, we've come to the end of this episode. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back again next week, but in the meantime, I encourage you to engage with our question for the week and pay attention to the important lessons you come across wherever you find them. You'll create a more purposeful and joyful life, and you'll start to feel more connected to the world and the people around you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Mythologizing the Bible as we did a deeper dive into the readings for the second Sunday in Ordinary Time, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. Remember that when ordinary people stop waiting, stop fragmenting into tribes, and start working together, humanity doesn't just survive, it continues to flourish. The Bible readings used for this episode are from the Holy Bible New International Version, NIV, copyright 1973, 1978, 1984, and 2011 by Biblica Inc., used by permission, all rights reserved worldwide. Thank you again for listening. If you like this content, please consider telling a friend about it. The more people who hear the positive messages I'm sharing, the better. Mythologizing the Bible is a live-streamed series held most Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on twitch.tv/thecodaproject. Every week, the audio of these Mythologizing the Bible presentations is released as a podcast. You can find the podcast at thecodaproject.com or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Pocket Casts. To learn more, to subscribe to my mailing list, and to keep up on everything I'm doing with the Coda Project, please visit thecodaproject.com.